Thank you and welcome everyone to this special Hi3 session on exploring how technology is transforming the way IVF labs operate, especially lab and work scheduling and cryo billing. As many of you know, scheduling in the IVF lab is a challenge especially for embryologists. Balancing procedures, staff shifts, and also unpredictable clinical dynamics can make daily planning a real nightmare, a real puzzle. And in addition, chasing up frozen sample, for example, making sure they are correctly stored, tracked, billed, and sometimes even transferred, had another layer of complexity, of stress, and of workload, obviously. That's why today's session is so relevant, because we will explore how smart tools and digital innovation can actually make a difference in how we manage these daily challenges. So my name is Alessandra Alteri, and I would like to introduce my co-host, Shaun Reed. Shaun is the embryology lab manager at Utan Fertility Center, where he has been for 11 years. He completed his master's degree at EVMS in 2018. When not in the lab, he likes to double with making social media content around IVF, nature, and making jokes. He also started competing this year in college track meets running, the 400 meters dash. The pain of that race and beating one or two college kids makes him feel alive. Wow. And another co-host is Ahmed El-Damen, a highly experienced and certified embryologist with over 24 years in our field. Ahmed is the IVF laboratory manager at ART Fertility Clinics in Dubai and the elected president of the Egyptian Society of Embryology and ART. He holds multiple advanced degrees and he's currently a PhD candidate, demonstrating a strong commitment to reproductive medicine and scientific advancement.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alessandra. And it's my pleasure also to introduce to you Alessandra Alteri. Alessandra earned her PhD in Cell and Developmental Biology from Sapienza University of Rome. She began working as an embryologist in 2011 and held a position at IRCC's San Rafael in Milan until March 2025. Currently, she is an expert in medically assisted production at Italy's National Transplant Center and adjunct professor of histology and embryology at Unicamilus in Rome. Previously, she taught biology at Vita Salute San Rafael University from 2021 to 2024. She is also an HRA certified senior clinical embryologist. She coordinates HRA's Safety and Quality Art Group and serves on the Italian Society of Reproduction Scientific Committee. She has published around 60 work publications and is a reviewer and sector editor for leading journals. Her research focuses on IVF lab quality, patient safety, and error prevention. Our pleasure, Alessandra.
All right, thank you, everybody. As you can see, we will keep the bio somewhat short this evening, but the full extensive resume of the careers of the experts here tonight can be found on the i3 website. This is an important part. Please place your questions in the question section of the portal and not on the chat function. That's where we'll be able to field questions from later. So in the question section of the portal. All right, without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. This talk is kindly sponsored by Fertile AI. Simon Lumsdon is VP of Sales at Fertile AI, specializing in fertility technology and medtech innovation. With experience at Lighthouse Fertility, Overture Life, and Vitro Life, he has a strong background in international business, strategy, and biotechnology. A graduate of Newcastle University and London Business School, Simon is passionate about using AI, genomics, and automation to improve infertility treatment. His work focuses on making fertility care more accessible and efficient through cutting-edge technology. Simon.
Thank you, Shaun, for the introduction, and thank you to all the panelists, and of course to I3 as well, and to everyone who's joined as well as a delegate tonight. I'm sure we're going to be in for a fantastic evening. So tonight I'll be talking on the topic of clinics that run like clockwork. I do have a disclosure that I work for Fertile AI, and of course, when we say running like clockwork, it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, of course, because we know that it's going to take a lot more than just 1 or 2 changes to make a clinic run so smoothly. But can there be some improvements made on some of these issues like communication and scheduling? And I've worked in fertility for around 16 years now and seen many different clinics around the world. And whether the clinic's doing 100 cycles a year or 5,000, these 2 issues seem to continue to crop up as being a challenge for clinics to get on top of and find the logistics and the means to make it work for them. Of course, the challenges are different if you're small to large, but the challenges are still there. So I'm going to take through both of these step by step, and we'll look at how technology is beginning to influence and perhaps even provide solutions for some of the challenges that are commonly faced. So first, the issue of communication. Now, communication's changed and how we do it over the years. On the left-hand side here, we see some very early communication from around 4,000 years ago. Someone's put an order in for some copper and it looks like it's gone wrong. And I'm guessing pens and paper didn't exist then, and certainly WhatsApp wasn't around. And someone's clearly got a rock and started chiseling away their complaint to their copper maker. And this is from the city of which I think is in modern day Iraq. And we had somebody shout out from Iraq. So a nice connection there. And of course, as time's gone on, we've had many different means of communicating. But in terms of the clinical setting, maybe it's fax in the early day, probably not to patients, more internally, but as an everyday means of certainly communicating to patients in a time-sensitive way, the telephone seems to be the main choice of communication. And I think it's typically going to fall on IVF coordinators or nurses to do that. Now, the way that fertility clinics are working and the types of cycles, I think, are changing. So we have to ask the question, does the way that we communicate need to evolve with that and catch up with that to some extent? And this quote here from a manager of an NHS clinic in the UK, I think encapsulates some of the tensions that we find. She's worked as a nurse manager, incredibly experienced through many clinics in the UK. And I'll read out the quote because I think it's got a lot for us and actually what we're going to talk about in the next few slides. So she says about her program, but I think this could apply to probably a lot of us around the world and the programs that we're working in. As cycles become more complex, volumes grow, and resources remain a constant, a frustration is the increasing amount of time healthcare professionals, particularly the nursing teams, spend conveying repetitive information via phone, or even simply trying to reach patients on the phone. To maintain high standards of care, we need to engage our patients who are often highly involved in their treatments during this complex medical procedure. This is especially, though not exclusively, true for Gen Z patients who tend to have a lot of additional questions and needs. And whilst I don't want to put words in her mouth, if I take a step back and say how I would interpret that, it's that healthcare professionals, whether they're nurses, embryologists, or doctors, spend a lot of time perhaps communicating repetitive information to patients time and time again. And actually the best use of their time is to do the things that only they can do, which is giving personalized, highly specific, highly expert care to their patients. So when we started to look at how we can begin to solve this, we thought, well, what information is communicated repeatedly? So how do we automate what is automatable? And things like repetitive messages can be templatized and sent to patients, especially if it's via a mobile app, which is what we're going to come on to, in a very simple way. For instance, messages like, be sure to come to your embryo transfer with a full bladder. And I'm sure you can think of a million more in your setting, especially if you're somebody who's communicating these kind of messages to patients on a routine basis. And then the other one is more the mode of how do we communicate these things. So user experience, what are patients engaging with on a day-to-day basis? And I know for me, I'm 41 years old, so I'm probably at the upper end of the patient age spectrum, but my phone is literally like always like 2 meters, if not closer to me. So I get everything from it. I'm going to it all the time, and meeting your patients where they're in a comfortable place or communicating to them in a way which is meaningful to them, I think is important. So there are a number of different mobile apps out there. I think the best ones are probably the ones that directly connect to the clinic and the patients themselves. So they integrate in some way into your EMR, which reduces the amount of duplication and additional messaging you have to make. There was a great study performed out of a group in Southampton that was looking at the impact of mobile apps in treatment cycles, lots of different ones from different providers. A general theme that they found was that it did reduce patient stress. This was just from surveys and doing interviews. And of course, there's a line of theory that says if you can push a notification to a patient through the app, so when it's, let's say, time to take their FSH or any form of medication or come to an appointment, that perhaps you get an increase in compliance as well. I've not seen any large-scale compelling data around that, but I'm sure perhaps it's maybe out there, or maybe someone's doing it, or maybe we should do it. If anybody would like to be involved in that, do let us know, because we're always keen on doing research. So I think there's many benefits that come from bringing the technology into the pocket of the patient and connecting them from the treatment cycle, from the clinic, into the palm of their hand. But there's also benefits for clinics as well. So I'll just touch on two of these. One of them is that to-do lists and tasks can be automatically prioritized and set. So for instance, in many of the apps, and certainly the one that we use, critical information which is pushed to the patient, let's say it's a dose change, that going from like 225 to 300 mid-cycle, the patient would be informed of this via the app. But then it's an important message. We don't want to leave anything to chance that they may not have read it. How does the nursing team know that this message is being received? So within the apps, there are a button you can push, or you have to push actually, to say that I've read this message, I understand it. There's normally a video that goes with it that you would need to watch on how you would change the dose or whatever the critical message is. And then that is fed back into the system. So the nursing and the coordination team know that this patient has read this message and it's been acknowledged. If it hasn't been messaged, it goes straight to the top of the to-do list. Perhaps another example which could be useful in terms of digitalizing this process is medicines management and looking at mitigating risks. So for instance, in our system, I imagine it's the same for many of these systems, that certain conflicts or errors within the cycle that would need attention or flagged. So as an example, perhaps a rise in estradiol level which is out of kilter with the number of follicles which has been recorded, or progesterone rising too early in the cycle, which would be a warning flag, is an indication that actually someone perhaps needs to look at this patient, and a little flag would appear on the system. So there's many benefits. I pick out two for the sake of time in order to focus on. ESHRE has just been, and we had a poster presentation. We were working with 5 of our customers across the US and Asia. And we were concerned, really, that by reducing the amount of interaction with the patients, that they would become dissatisfied. It's all very well in theory saying, automate what can be automated, and patients don't want to hear repetitive tasks. But until you've actually asked them and done some work on this, it's hard to really ascertain it. So the clinics that we worked with, they put out surveys to the patients. Just over a third of them replied. And we had very positive feedback, 4.6 out of 5 satisfaction with the way that communication was being handled. And this was consistent across the various age groups as well. You could probably say there's a slight trend towards the younger age group, but nothing too major. What was surprising to us, and this was driven by the clinics themselves, we didn't enforce this, it wasn't anything coming from the companies, was just the natural decline in the average calls per cycle. So the savings in time that the clinic were making was quite significant in terms of the number of calls that we're making and the time that was spent on calls. And speaking to the nursing staff who were typically driving this, what we found was that as they became more and more confident in the capability of the messages that were going out and the fact that they were being read and complied with, they didn't feel the need to do some of those additional calls that they would have been doing previously, just to give out again those like really important but repetitive pieces of information. And they were able to focus on more aspects of the patient cycle that were really unique to them, and I guess scratch the itches that the patients had in a phone call. So the next part of kind of addressing some of those workflow issues and clinics working smoothly is around scheduling. And typically there's an interplay between looking at a balance between what's clinically best for the patient, but also like we need to run a clinic and make sure that we have staff to operate it on given days. And sometimes those things are not compatible exactly together, and clinics obviously need to sometimes have a day where they're closed. So how do we make sure that we can optimize the trigger timing and subsequent egg collection and the scheduling around that, and ovulation timing in terms of frozen embryo transfers? So we're going to take the first one in terms of OPUs, and this is data from a real clinic, the number of egg collections that they do on any given day over the course of a month. And you can see it goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And it's pretty dramatic. And maybe as you resonate with this, maybe as it looks completely alien to you and you're running perfectly smooth already. Most of the clinics that I speak to, it's something like this. And this is a very inefficient way to run a clinic, very difficult to staff, very difficult to get a daily routine going. And from a manufacturing perspective, which is perhaps a crude way of looking at it, but it is one way of looking at it, that this is alien to how manufacturing is done. There's a principle from lean manufacturing called Hijunka, which talks about not having too much input or too much output, but keeping things relatively steady. So how do we try and achieve that? Well, we went around building some algorithms from 100,000 patients worth of data. And what we found was not unsurprising to some extent. So 50% of patients have one optimal day to trigger. The rest of the cohort, the other 50%, either have 2 or 3 days in which they could trigger. There's a lot more flexibility. So we set out to determine what is the 50% of patients that have one optimal day to trigger, and make sure that we trigger on those days to get the most mature oocytes. But then where we have flexibility, how can we move some of these patients' trigger day around in order to smooth out this peaks and troughs, or manipulate it how we want? We don't work on Sunday, so how can we do the best for the patient and the clinic in those circumstances? And that's what I'm going to walk you through now. So this is a screenshot from the software. This would ideally be in the background. You would never need to see this. It would integrate with your EMR and just be part of a stim sheet, but the AI would come up here. And what we're looking for is a curve that looks something like this, with a dome, if you like, and a green dot being at the top. So the green dot, as you can imagine, is indicative that you can trigger, or at least it's the best day here to trigger. And then we want to see that taper off because we've reached the total maximum number of mature oocytes. So it's day 8 in the cycle, far too early to be thinking about triggering. The system's saying we're not at the top yet. Day 10, we're still not at the top yet. But on day 12, what we see here is one green, and on day 13, another green. So this patient, Sarah, and obviously these are not the real names, Sarah could be triggered on day 12 or day 13, but day 14, you would see a drop off, which is interesting actually, because it predicts an increase in the total number of oocytes, but the mature oocytes does drop. So it's basing it no statistical significance, day 12, day 13. So Sarah has 2 days that you could trigger. Totally different patient, Hannah Wilson, she's got this more classic curve where there's only one optimal day to trigger. So that's just an example from that. So we needed to test the accuracy of this and how good it was at predicting actually the maximum number of mature oocytes. So this is retrospective data taken from clinics in Asia, Europe, and North America. And what's interesting is that we call discordant where the patient was triggered on a white or a red day, and concordant where it was green. So in most of the cases, actually, the patient was triggered on what we consider a suboptimal day. And the result of that actually is when the patient was triggered on an optimal day, there's a much higher number of oocytes, of mature oocytes, which carries through into usable embryos. Now, this is retrospective data. We have started a prospective study, RCT, to validate this as well. Now, moving on to the other type of scheduling. So in a frozen embryo transfer, and there's huge debate at the moment between natural and program cycles. And as we've said a few times, ESHRA has just been. There was a number of talks on this. I was at Best of ASRM and ESHRA. There was a debate. There's been presentations. There's the NACPRO RCT, which is ongoing at the moment. And I think to some extent, it depends on the country that you're in, and it would be interesting to hear from anybody listening if there's a majority of programmed or natural where you live, and also if that's changing as well. So in terms of what I mean by natural and programmed, and of course, I think everybody knows this, but just to be sure about it, with a natural cycle, we're obviously talking about placing the embryo back in the patient's natural cycle. We consider if the patient's been triggered, it still classes as a natural cycle. So a natural modified cycle still falls under our remit of natural. During the cycle, there's quite a lot of monitoring that needs to take place, and sometimes blood tests and obviously ultrasounds as well. In a programmed cycle, estrogen is given to build the lining, and progesterone is added to create the receptive environment for the embryo, and the window of receptivity is much longer. So in a natural cycle, it's relatively fixed because you're looking for 1 day of ovulation, which can be tricky to predict. With the program cycle, it's much more forgiving. So the question is, why would anyone really bother with a natural cycle when the program cycle seems to actually already overcome a lot of the issues that I've just talked about with scheduling? Well, it largely comes down to this reason here. So there's a body of data which is coming out from population studies in Sweden and Japan, which indicates that there's a strong suggestion that in patients who have had a programmed FET, there's an increased risk of hypertensive disorders like preeclampsia. So there's certainly where I am in the UK, and I think in other markets, and again, I'd be interested to hear from you, whilst still probably the majority are programmed, there's a move towards natural, but these issues of having to do multiple ultrasounds, tracking potentially of bloods, being unpredictable with when the actual ovulation is going to be, sometimes missing it, cancelling the cycle, having to go again. I've also heard from embryologists on numerous occasions, there's a knock on the door on a Sunday morning, and all of a sudden there's 4 extra FETs that we weren't sure about. So the planning of this can be very, very difficult. So here's the kind of the nub of it. I know consensus in fertility are not easy to come by, and there's probably lots of people who might disagree with this with good reason, but if we can roll with it, that generally natural is probably better in terms of building that corpus luteum and reducing the impact of any hypertensive disorders. But scheduling and predicting the actual ovulation carries a risk that maybe makes it clinically or logistically ineffective to do. So the challenge is, how do we accurately predict ovulation? That's the first one. And then how do we build flexibility into the scheduling? So again, we look to solve this with a very similar method. The system we built only works off hormones. We don't need to do any ultrasound testing to predict ovulation. So around day 8, we give the system the bloods that it needs. It gives us an indication of when ovulation and subsequent transfer will be. It's saying it's way off. You need more bloods. And it actually tells us, I want bloods on this day. So I want bloods on day 12 in order to help make my mind up. Right now, I'm split. I'm not entirely sure. It's going to be either this day or this day. So I want more bloods. Most of the time, the system will actually get it in 2. But in this instance, it needs 3. It's landed on Friday the 17th of November, which means transfer will be this day. If the physician wanted to trigger the patient before, this would be the last day that they could trigger the patient. And again, in retrospective studies, and these numbers are smaller because when we were actually building the model, we built it to actually look at follicle rupture, not an LH surge. So that was quite invasive for the patient. They had to come for multiple scans, sometimes more than once a day. So what we found, though, still was in the concordant group, the implantation and pregnancy rates were higher than in the discordant group. But I think even if they were at a similar level, the benefit that comes from not having to do perhaps as many scans, and certainly only having to do probably one ultrasound to look at the endometrial architecture, is a huge benefit in terms of the operational efficiency of the clinic. We then did a follow-up study, which was a much larger data set. So using that same model and then thinking again about some of the objectives that we had around scheduling. So looking, can we transfer on a day where the patient is having their natural cycle or a modified cycle? Well, in this cohort of 4,000 patients, again, it's retrospective. So we're looking at the data and then manipulating it according to what the algorithm would predict. 93% of patients could be accommodated through either full natural cycle and more than half, or a triggered. The rest of the patients, they would either have their cancel cycled due to landing on a day when the clinic was closed, which was a Sunday, or the software unfortunately missed ovulation because it was early. A secondary outcome we wanted to achieve was to ensure that Saturday, which was a low staff day, wasn't any busier than through Monday to Thursday. And then smooth out the number of collections number of transfers that were on during the week, which we were fairly successful with, but not a huge success. You can see Monday is a little lower than Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then Friday really jumps. But Saturday, a low staff day, is in line with the majority of the working week. But what the clinic really wanted to achieve was this low Sunday. To try and be as close to the day of ovulation as possible if we were to trigger, and 90% of the cases were triggered within 2 days of ovulation. And as I've mentioned, one of those key points, the number of monitoring cycles to achieve this was in 2.4. So what that looks like, if your graphical, is a little bit more like this. So you can see really low workload on a Sunday, normal on a Saturday, but lots of triggering going on. Most of the cycles are being pulled backwards into here. So you can see Friday was quite a big work day, but at least it would be predictable. And the system would give you 10 days notice on when the numbers of FETs that were going to be on any given day. And then Monday through to Thursdays, mostly utilizing natural ovulation FETs. So we need to bring all this together in terms of making something actually work for clinics, and how do we begin to make sense and actually kind of manipulate some of the flexibility that we have. So this is a workflow chart that we've devised, and I'm just going to show it to you for the retrievals. So the retrievals are all the lines in green on a given day. The dark blues are the FETs, and this clinic, and this is entirely customizable to every clinic's need because every clinic is slightly different. They set a limit on how many egg collections they want to do. So here it's been set at 7. And you can see on Thursday, it's gone over. So there's a red line, there's a green line going over. So on Thursday, it looks like it's going to be 9 egg collections. Now, if you can remember earlier on in the presentation, I said that there were some patients who had more than one green dot. So there was more than one optimal day to trigger. So with this button here, balance, the system will automatically, according to the presets and your preferences that you've defined, will move the patients either back or forward. And I think the moving forward in time, so earlier in the week, is actually quite a unique thing. When we talk to clinicians, typically they're much more inclined to push by 1 or 2 days, but because the system knows it's always going to be landing on a green, so there's no clinical difference, it's more than happy to pull into the future as well in order to balance out the number of OPUs. It will do the same as well for FETs. That will be, of course, much further down the week, and it's the system aggregates data which has been taken from the EMR. It's constantly updating with a prediction of the busyness that's coming through the course of the coming weeks. So what does this look like when modeled out? So this is back with our clinic with the ups and downs OPUs. They were running 7 days a week. You can see it's a busy program. I mean, they were doing upwards of 25 collections on some days. They wanted to smooth out. So instead of having all these peaks and troughs post-smoothing, you can see here that if you take the 10 and the 20 as rough deviations, it only drops out once, and the standard deviation before and after balancing is almost halved. We did a similar model with a group that was doing 1700 OPUs. They wanted to completely reduce weekend work. That's staff limitations and wanted to have a skeleton staff over a weekend. So before they did the balancing, they only managed to get one Saturday and one Sunday with 0 egg collections over the course of a year. Post balancing, that's jumped to 8 for a Saturday and 14 for a Sunday. But also in benefit, if you look at the percentage of egg collections over the course of the week, much more balanced and smoothed out. So just again, in terms of staffing, workload, smoothed out, very easy to manage and know what you're going to face every given day. So bringing all this together, I believe that using technology and certainly automating those messages that can be automated will reduce the workload for nursing and maintain high patient satisfaction. AI can help with scheduling, particularly with ovulation and trigger day, allowing for that flexibility, which will suit your clinic's own needs. It's highly customizable without compromising clinical outcome. And if you have to compromise in some way, at least you are knowing from a data-driven perspective what that compromise is as well. Operational efficiencies in terms of balancing out the workload evenly over the course of the week, and then reducing those operating procedures on days that are not good for the clinic. And of course, fewer monitoring appointments as well in natural frozen embryo transfers. I think the average of 2.5 is good while still maintaining the high clinical pregnancy rates. So, of course, in finishing, I had to ask ChatGPT what a clinic that ran like clockwork would look like, and it looks like it took it very literally. So thank you for that, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Simon. Very interesting talk for embryologists, and I have a lot of questions, but mainly I have a question that all embryologists want to know. In the future, will it be possible not to perform embryo biopsy during the weekend?
Do you mean through the OPU scheduling? Can we go that far, or will AI actually do the biopsy itself?
Yes, especially the ovocell retrieval during on Monday, on Tuesday. Obviously.
Yeah. Well, yes. So we can do that. So it's actually a function I didn't show you, but in the background, we're mapping out the embryology workload. So we've identified like fertility preservation, so oocyte vitrification as being something which is very time consuming and a bit of a pain.
Yeah.
ICSI and biopsy. So off the back of when you trigger, you also get an indication of the workload in the laboratory as well. But as I say, the system's very customizable. So we can, for you, we can definitely make it so there's no Sunday biopsies.
Fantastic. Thank you, Simon. Okay, let's move on to the next talk. Next talk is kindly sponsored by Fertility Building Solution, and the speaker is Shakil Kanji. He's an ex-Google software engineer and the founder and CEO of Fertility Building Solution, a Canadian technology company focused on modernizing cryostorage building, content workflows, and patient communications for fertility clinics. After his time at Google, Shakil entered the fertility sector by partnering with his sister, Dr. Salina Kanji, a reproductive endocrinologist, to tackle operational challenges that impact both clinics and patients. So now the talk is the cryostorage pain chain, a data-backed case for change. So thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Alteri, and thank you so much to the International IVF Initiative for having me. It's a great pleasure to be speaking here today. So my name is Shakil Kanji, and I'm the founder and CEO of Fertility Billing Solution. And as Dr. Alteri mentioned, my background is in software engineering. But as a startup leader, I now find myself doing engineering, data science, sales, marketing, customer support, and so much more. And again, I'd also like to start by saying that I'm so happy to be speaking to the leaders, in the fertility industry today. And I have my sister to thank, Dr. Selena Kanji, for pulling me into this industry and for introducing the particular problem that we're going to talk about today. So let's get started with today's talk, which is the cryostorage pain chain, a data-backed case for change. So today we'll dive into why embryo inventories around the globe continue to grow at such a rapid pace, and then we'll explore practical solutions to help you think about how you can responsibly manage what's going on in your clinic. Let's get started. So first, we'll start with a simple definition of the concept of a pain chain. So I was first introduced to this concept back in university when I was participating in a case competition. And it's quite a common term in the world of startups and startup companies. So a pain chain is defined as a series of interconnected problems where each issue creates and worsens the next, leading to a compounding problem for the entire organization. So basically it describes situations where there's a perfect storm brewing, and it's actually what startups and new businesses look for when entering new markets. So today we're going to focus on the cryostorage pain chain. And I want to clarify that we're not focusing on the physical storage aspect or safety aspects of embryo cryopreservation, but instead we're going to focus on the patient-clinic relationship and how a vicious cycle of circumstances are creating pain for patients and clinics alike. So I'm going to start this off with a simple claim. It's the reason why startups and tech entrepreneurs are beginning to pay attention to the fertility industry and why technology continues to improve in the space at such a rapid pace. And it's the claim that the entire IVF market is growing. So we all know this, and I'm sure many of you work in clinics and labs that have grown over the past few years. So this is the first link on the chain, and it's actually not so painful. It's good for the industry. So let's move on. And I'm sure many of you know as well that PGTA has become increasingly prevalent over the last decade. So I'll start by citing an ASRM committee opinion, which stated that the percentage of cycles in the US that utilized PGTA rose from 14% in 2014 to 44% in 2019. And that number continues to rise over time. With the widespread adoption of PGTA has also come the increase in freeze-all cycles, which has created an immediate need for cryostorage while the patient awaits their PGTA results. Whereas in the past, a patient may have only created one embryo and immediately undergone a fresh transfer, that protocol is becoming less and less common. In fact, multiple clinics that I've spoken to have said that greater than 99% of their cycles are PGTA and freeze-all. So you can see how this would increase the need for on-site cryostorage. And let's move on to the next link in the pain chain, which is the aneuploidy dilemma. So we've all seen graphs like this that show increasing rates of aneuploid embryos amongst patients of advanced maternal age. But what's the real implication for cryostorage? The problem that many of us have witnessed firsthand is that it's very difficult for patients to let go of any embryos that they have stored, especially if they have not achieved their family building goals. So let's say a patient does an IVF cycle. They're not successful on their transfer, and then they only have aneuploid embryos remaining. Now, chances are they might do another cycle, or perhaps they give up on their treatment altogether, or maybe they turn to another fertility clinic promising them a better chance. In the case that they do continue treatment with your clinic, a nurse or a patient coordinator may reach out to the patient and ask them to sign discard paperwork for their aneuploid embryos, but chances are there is no standard operating procedure in place to do so, and the embryos remain in storage for a full year. Now, in the case that the patient has given up on treatment and they aren't returning to your clinic, imagine how emotionally taxing that could be for the patient to just get an invoice a year later. Now, let's also think about the case where all of the embryos a patient created turned out to be aneuploid. And we all know that hearing the news that the patient doesn't have any viable embryos can be extremely emotional and difficult, and that might not be the right time to ask them to sign discard paperwork. So what do you do? And this really ends up being a really tricky situation, requires careful navigation, and ultimately it adds to our pain chain of ever-growing cryo inventories. So let's move on to the fourth link in the chain, which is the challenge of abandoned embryos. So I'm sure many of you have seen news articles citing the term abandoned when it comes to embryo preservation, and it's really a hot topic these days. So what does it mean for an embryo to be abandoned? We'll start with the ASRM definition for unclaimed embryos, which is a reasonable time has passed, diligent contact efforts have been made, and no written instructions have come from progenitors. The HFEA, on the other hand, in the UK, defines abandoned embryos as frozen embryos stored at fertility clinics where contact with the individuals who provided them has been lost, or where they have indicated they no longer wish to have control over the embryo's fate. Now, the HFEA in particular is interesting here because they've actually defined embryo storage duration limits, which helps clinics in the context of abandoned embryos. They've essentially stated in the Health and Care Act of 2022 that there is a need for renewed consent every 10 years. And if consent is not renewed, the embryos can be considered for abandonment. However, it's imperative that clinics have shown reasonable and considerable effort to contact the patient before considering the embryos for abandonment. Now, the reasonable effort portion is up for interpretation, but later in the talk, we'll discuss why it's absolutely vital for clinics to have an organized repository of data with a history of attempted patient contact. Around the globe, we can expect that other governing bodies will, similar to the HFEA, provide more specific guidance around storage duration limits and consent renewal periods for cryostorage. Now, I'm excited to share a case study with you that Fertility Billing Solution recently did with a Canadian partner clinic, Markham Fertility Centre. So this information was submitted as an abstract to the Canadian Fertility and Andrology Society to be presented at the upcoming meeting in September. And we collaborated on a retroactive study of 2 years of data, where the first year of data examines cryostorage behavior prior to the implementation of any automated cryostorage billing system. And the second year of data examined the impact of implementing such a system with Fertility Billing Solution. And the findings were quite significant. So for context, Markham Fertility Centre is a clinic that's been operating their lab for over 30 years and recently began to hone in on this issue. So we weren't surprised at the number of stored samples, embryos, eggs, and semen samples, for which the clinic was not collecting cryostorage fees for. So in this study, an abandoned sample was defined as any sample for which the patient did not respond to communications or invoices. And from the first year to the second year, outstanding and irrecoverable invoices dropped from 48% to 19.9%, while patient-initiated requests to discontinue storage after receiving an invoice rose from 6.9% to 18.7%. So we've been so happy to work with a clinic like Markham that's been at the forefront of patient experience, and we had a chance to actually collaborate with them on specialized communications that go out to patients who are only storing aneuploid embryos. So a special thank you to the team at Markham and Amy G, an incredible embryologist who spearheaded this research effort. So the final link on the cryostorage pain chain that I'd like to talk about today really focuses on the patient aspect of all of this. So while clinics are facing ever-growing stores of frozen embryos and they need to eventually resolve this problem, the patient doesn't know about that. And in the time we've spent working with patients to walk them through their disposition options, we've noticed one recurring theme, and that is the language with which we describe these processes. Discard, dispose, destroy. It can be tough for a patient who's having to make an emotional decision. So at Fertility Billing Solution, this is really going to be one of our top focuses over the next year, creating better language around the embryo disposition process. Of course, consent forms need to have the correct legal jargon, and patients need to be fully informed. But we'd like to work on this problem, and if there's anyone who has ideas or anyone listening who wants to help us with this project, I encourage you to reach out to me or to our team with your thoughts and ideas. So we've discussed the length of the pain chain, which includes IVF clinics being busier than ever, more embryos being stored per patient, the dilemma of storing aneuploid embryos and when to ask patients to make a disposition decision, the topic of abandoned embryos, and finally, the emotional burden for patients when making disposition decisions. So now that we've defined the pain chain, I want to talk about the implications of clinics that are sitting on massive stores of cryopreserved embryos. There's quite a few implications, but I'd like to focus on a few in particular. And the first is the administrative burden that is growing and likely falling on you or your team. Often in labs, it's an embryologist who's assigned to either sending out invoices or liaising with the finance team to provide an updated inventory report on a fixed cadence. So this can be extremely time-consuming, and it doesn't make sense for highly trained embryologists to be taking on more and more administrative burden. Now, the second implication is a little bit wider reaching in the clinic, and that is the topic of liability. So we've all heard stories of tank failures, and it's something that could keep us up at night. And there's countless innovations that we'll get to in a second that are so focused on preventing these disasters from taking place. But in the rare event that a disaster does occur, the last thing you want is hundreds of patients who had completed their family building joining a class action lawsuit. So food for thought, but there's value to culling your embryo stores for the sake of managing your liability. And this brings us to our last point on the implications of growing cryo inventories, and that is the cost. Monitoring, alerting, RFID, off-site storage, on-site robots, more doers, more staff. The list goes on. There's no doubt that the cost to your clinic of storing abandoned embryos is significant, and it scales pretty linearly with the number of samples you're holding on to. So my question to you today is this: how long can we sustain scaling costs before we address the volume of our cryostorage inventories? So before I end this talk, I wanted to offer some practical solutions to our attendees who might be able to relate to the problems we discussed and don't know how to approach the elephant in the room. So have no fear, because my team at Fertility Billing Solution has spent the last 2 years thinking exactly about this problem. So we'll dive into our first solution, which is consider shortening the prepaid storage window. So what does this mean and how can this help? So a typical process for a patient undergoing IVF is that they pay a bundled cycle fee, and it includes some amount of free or prepaid storage. Typically, that window is 1 year of storage, which seems to have been the widely adopted standard, and few clinics have thought about changing it. It's easy to know when to bill patients because you just bill them every year on the freeze date. So we actually conducted an internal study at Fertility Billing Solution where we compared the patient response rate across 2 categories. The first is where patients received their first communication from us 3 months after their freeze date, and the other was where patients received their first communication from us 1 year post-freeze. And the findings weren't surprising. Patients were significantly more responsive and willing to take action when they were contacted earlier rather than later. So yes, this is something you can and should change. It takes a bit of work to get the logistics right, but it's a worthwhile effort. Now, moving on to our second practical solution, which is to automate your patient outreach. So our internal data has shown that it takes an average of 2 touch points to get a patient to pay a storage invoice, and it takes an average of 7 touch points to get a couple to complete their embryo disposition forms remotely. Countless email reminders need to be made. Someone on your team needs to be doing this if you want patients to complete their actions. So there's examples of tools that can be used to automate email sending, such as Constant Contact and MailChimp. However, none of them are HIPAA compliant. Luckily, Fertility Billing Solution is. So moving on, let's get to our third practical recommendation, which is to create resources and remove barriers for patients and give patients a place to land. So coming back to a typical workflow for how clinics might communicate with patients, on the freeze anniversary, you might send an invoice to a patient, you might send an invoice and a disposition consent form, or you might just send them a letter asking them to contact you. In any of those cases, it's very possible that a patient, 1, has no idea what they have left in storage, 2, they don't fully understand what their options are, or 3, they feel comfortable ignoring the communication because they don't understand it. So our recommendation at the very least is that you create some kind of online resource on your website, perhaps a YouTube video or somewhere where you outline specifically what the patient's options are with your clinic. So you might offer family-to-family donation or donation to assist with training in the lab. And it's so important that you inform patients of their options so that they can be informed when completing their disposition consent forms. On the subject of removing barriers, if you require every patient and their partner to be physically present to sign disposition consent forms, that is a significant barrier. If you allow remote signing but require patients to use a notary, which is common practice in the United States, consider integrating with an e-notary and offering to pay the notary fees, or use DocuSign with identity verification. The cost savings that you'll achieve from reducing storage burden can far outweigh the costs of getting patients to take action. So these are just a few examples of barriers in the patient's journey of taking action, and there are tons of other solutions that can be implemented. So moving on to our final practical recommendation, which is to track everything. So we discussed earlier how the HFEA instituted specific guidance regarding the limits of cryostorage duration, the mandatory consent renewal period, and the process of marking a specimen as abandoned. And it was a leading move for the regulatory body, and it provided clinics with a framework for dealing with the growing stores of abandoned embryos. While the US, Canada, and many other countries don't have as specific guidance that the UK does, we can expect that it might eventually come. And that guidance essentially enables and empowers clinics to take the necessary action on their abandoned inventory. But it's imperative that you create a comprehensive audit trail as a legal safeguard, proving that you did everything you can within reason to contact the patient and get their up-to-date consent on how they wish to proceed. So this additional layer of auditing can be implemented. There's ways to implement to see if patients have opened emails, if they've logged into a cryostorage portal, or initiated any actions. Great, so I'd like to finish off by describing a goal that I think every clinic can strive for and achieve, and that is the goal of cryostorage equilibrium. Now, what does that mean? That means that the number of new samples that are entering cryostorage in your lab is equal to the number of samples exiting cryostorage. So if you have a streamlined process, you can determine what your retention rate is. That is the percentage of samples that you can expect to remain in storage 1 year from now. And depending on your patient population and clinical practices, a typical retention rate can range between 50 to 80%. So let's say your lab takes in 300 samples a year and you have 1,000 samples in storage. If your retention rate was about 70%, that means that you might never have to buy another tank again, unless you increased your cycle volume. So to conclude, your cryo inventory does not need to grow forever. and achieving equilibrium is quite a possibility. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening. Again, my name is Shakil from Fertility Building Solution, and please reach out to me directly for anything at all, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Shakil. It was a very simple, nice, quiet presentation. Thank you so much. And really, it affects every single embryologist in the IVF lab. So from my side, just two very small questions, and I think you have a lot at the end of the meeting. So my first question is, do you think really that changing the language of speaking to the patient, explaining to them more about the discarding of embryos, will change their decision taking into the action of discarding or keeping their embryos in storage? This is my first question. My second question is, do you think if all these remote trials failed, do you think of assigning any team to visit patients at home just to sign the consent forms? For this, I don't know.
All right, so I'll tackle the first question first, which is the language and the emotional aspect. So, I think a really common scenario is a patient receives, paperwork or some indication that they need to take action, and the language is very, very blunt. And I'm not saying that improving the language might actually change the outcome of what a patient decides to do, but I do think that it can encourage patients to actually sit down and make a difficult decision if the language is a little bit more welcoming. So while it may not, result in more donations to science or to research, it may just result in more patients responding because they feel comfortable, they feel like they're being treated with care and communicated with respect. So I definitely see value in just improving on that communication to help with the emotional aspect of disposing your frozen embryos. And on this second note, that's a great question. So, like I said, the HFEA defines, being able to mark embryos as abandoned. It's a little bit vague, but they say you have to have taken reasonable effort. So, we're able to do emails, phone calls, send letters. I would say, maybe going on Facebook and messaging them would be an intermediary step before showing up at their door. But we can't rule that out as something you might do.
Okay. Thank you so much. And now we move to Shaun back again.
Yes, thank you guys. We have made it to the Q&A section of the webinar. So we're going to start rattling off questions for our speakers. First one is for Simon. How do you work out the best embryologist/workload ratio? There have been many papers, but often flawed. How do you base your scheduling equation to avoid too much work on one day? And there's kind of a second question that's related. Do you have any data about embryologist satisfaction, like using mobile app?
Cool. Thanks, Shaun, and whoever asked the question. So the way we've structured it at the moment is relatively simple. So we've assigned hours to certain tasks and also looked at whether those tasks are performed in the morning or afternoon typically. One of the challenges we have is that lots of clinics work differently. So we've made the system intentionally customizable. So you can log in when there's going to be a given procedure, for instance, biopsy. But again, sometimes those aren't known until mid-cycle. So it is very hard to map out in a consistent way. But one of the things that we've worked hard on is making it customizable and working hard on an onboarding process. What I would say as well is that we've just launched this at ESHRE, so it's brand new. But I think as we move forward and we get a more clear idea of where those kind of crunch points are, especially for embryology, then we can make the system a lot more bespoke in that way and accurate. In terms of feedback from embryologists, again, I guess it varies from market to market. Some countries, the embryologists don't have an awful lot of communication with the patients. Others, it seems to be much more engaged. So we do have an embryology module in the app, so they can enter information like birth rates and development. Some of that's automated, so the embryologist doesn't need to do anything, but then there's some pieces of information where we've put like a safeguard on. So if there was a complete failed FERT or all the embryos came back aneuploid, then that would trigger to the embryologist to be like, you might want to give a phone call in this instance.
Yeah, I like that question because this is something that's always on my mind as an embryologist, embryology lab manager, is how do we optimize the workload? And with AI, like we have so many data points that we could be putting in. Like, should we be polling our embryologists occasionally, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad did today suck? And your AI software could be like, okay, noted, Wednesday was terrible, Thursday not so bad. Maybe it knows, what the staffing in my lab is like each day of the week, and it knows who's trained on what, who's proficient on this or that. So I think it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, and the data's there. So again, I don't want to kind of wax too lyrical about the software, but we also hook into clinical outcomes as well, and any KPIs that you want to measure. So at the moment, we aren't looking at correlations between staffing, let's say number of OPUs and number of oocytes, and then procedures and outcomes. But the data's there, so in theory we could.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. KPIs on top of that too, because labs will say something like that. We go through periods where we're super busy and we feel like our outcomes suffered during that time, and being able to show if it did or not would be helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Simon, just a question because about the mobile app. So embryologists can have this app on the phone, okay? But a big problem in the lab for embryologists is the burnout. What do you think about the using of this app? Because embryologists can take work at home in any moment, and they can never disconnect.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. So I might not have explained it perfectly clear. So the app is just for the patient. So you would still, and maybe this is a bad thing, depends on your EMR, you'd still have to use your EMR. And there's some wonderful EMRs out there, of course, as well. But so the information, we connect into your EMR. So the information that would be in there will go directly to the patient. So sometimes maybe the EMR has a portal or something like that. It's kind of replacing that portal. So instead of having to log on, the information is going directly to the patient and they're getting the alert. And from the embryology perspective, there's an embryology module in the app. It's pretty simple in terms of what the patient gets in terms of information. So it's kept to a relative minimum. But then there are education modules which you can again customize and flesh out. We have a whole bunch of them. So things like, what is PGT, when would you do it, what is a blastocyst, what's the gradings of blastocyst, all this kind of stuff. So there's information there for the patients to kind of look at their own leisure, if you like, and then also go back over a few times. So hopefully that means that there's less questions around like embryology, like what is a blastocyst or what is a 5AB, and you can have the conversation where you've got whatever your grading system is, this, and this. For you, this means this, and this. And that's what we're trying to kind of move into. Of course, if you need to explain again to the patient like what the gradings mean, then of course you're going to do it. But some of them will have read up on it and have a good idea, and it's all there for them. That's the premise. So the embryologists don't need to take anything home with them.
Yes. One question for Shakil from God Select from Nigeria. How can an embryologist gather information about the various impacts of the pain chain on clients?
Sure. So I think that there's starting points for a clinic when assessing whether they have a problem or not. So however your inventory is managed and stored, that could be within your EMR, that could be, some clinics have done it in Excel. However you're storing the data, being able to analyze how many of those embryos, perhaps you can start by looking what freeze year are those, the distribution of freeze year across your embryos to see, how many embryos is your clinic holding from, more than 5 years ago, and is there a likelihood of those embryos being used again? And then, from the revenue and finance aspect, if you're able to combine data from your accounting software or from however you're doing your invoicing and combining and comparing that with your inventory, you'd start to see trends and you'd start to be able to see, is my clinic missing out on revenue? Are our cryostorage costs higher than they should be? And start to answer some of those basic questions and then start to kind of explore a solution as to how you can tackle that.
So the first step is you are analyzing the clinic's revenue. If they are losing money and you are explaining to them how much they are losing by keeping the embryos without disposal or something like this.
So that's typically, something that a clinic can do internally, if they have the tools to kind of do a high level analysis. And that's also something that we've helped with, which is, doing some scoping, some analysis to see, what can really the impact be and the ROI be for implementing a third-party solution to help with this problem.
A question right along those lines is many clinics have their own system of billing collection and dedicated staff that chase and manage the frozen inventory. Will they really risk losing revenue by outsourcing to a third party, which will come at a cost?
So that's a really great question. And I think, I've seen clinics that have a team of people that really kind of chase after patients and make sure that patients are paying. And, those clinics are probably, close to maximizing their revenue, but they're also incurring pretty significant costs by having full-time staff chasing after these patients. So our software is meant to be a companion to people in your clinic that are doing these jobs. So, if your clinic has a team of people that is chasing after patients, there's likely so much manual effort that's being done, pulling data from your EMR, pulling data from your accounting software, pushing data back in. There's a lot of manual processes going on here. So, if you feel as though your clinic is already maximizing revenue, there's definitely room for cost savings on the other hand by, maybe scaling back on some of the manual outreach efforts and using automation to just kind of keep in contact with patients. And again, offering patients a, better patient experience rather than, maybe just getting phone calls and invoices. So there's a lot of room for improvement, even if a clinic feels as though they're already doing great.
It gets so messy trying to keep track, the paper trail like you were showing, because I look at notes in our EMR and you'll see things like called patient about signing their consents. Okay, are they refusing to sign their consents? Is the husband unreachable? So it gets so messy.
Yeah, especially when there's, complex situations with, separated couples or, one patient has left the country. It's a difficult process. And like I said, it takes so many touch points to complete the process of signing the discard paperwork.
From Dallas, Obiangeli Anozie say our patients are often a free embryo discard consultation, after which a discard consent is sent to them. The consent gives them the option to choose either to donate the aneuploid embryos to research or outright discard. It's very interesting. For example, in Italy, we cannot discard embryos. So for us, it's a big problem. because we have a lot of embryos in our tanks. And a question, for example, is what percentage of legacy samples abandoned do you think most clinics have? For example, in Italy, a lot.
Yeah. So I think, you know, it depends on the, like you said, the geographic region, the regulations and guidelines of how you can deal with samples. But I think pretty much around the globe, it's common that if you don't have signed recent informed consent from a patient and their partner, you cannot discard embryos. So again, this really depends on the age of the clinic as well. So I think, you know, maybe in the early 2000s, in the early 2010s, this problem was really not so widely looked at, and you know, tanks were just starting to fill up, and you know, it just kind of came at it was seen as kind of just like a cost of doing business for clinics. So that, you know, estimating the actual percentage, I think you know, it can be anywhere between 20% to 50%, you know, depending on, like I said, the age of the clinic and how they've viewed this problem and tried to tackle it in the past. But without putting bodies and you know, technology behind this problem, it's just bound to pile up, and over time that percentage of abandoned specimens, it continues to rise.
Yeah. In Italy, for example, we cannot discard embryos also unemployed. It's not possible. And yes, it's not possible to do research on these embryos also.
So that's really interesting. Even if a patient has explicitly given consent and wishes to discard, they cannot.
Yes. Also, if patients want, but it's impossible for embryologists. Yes. And the problem is the cost, because we have a huge cost in our bank.
So do you store those embryos off-site, Alessandra? Or is there like sort of areas,
Yes, it's a
aneuploid embryos that are like in a
Yes, in fact,
monitored way?
many IVF clinics in Italy perform an agreement with a big banks outside of the clinics in order to
Yeah.
obtain, yes, for the space, because the problem is the space in our banks. Yeah.
Yes. Simon, I have a question for you, please. Do you have any estimate on how much is the false decisions that patients can take based on wrong translation of scientific information from the application?
If a patient gets false information from the
Not false information. Maybe sometimes the information is clear and right, but sometimes some patients translate this information wrongly, and for example, they take the medication wrong based on something they understood in a wrong way, different than all the people that they can understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's plausible.
Yes.
It's plausible that could happen. It hasn't happened yet, but I think some of the safeguards that we put in place are all the messages that we would create are actually they're the clinic's messages. So we spend a lot of time working with them, and we're also working with a number of different large programs as well that are seeing thousands of patients a year. So our largest site has around 9,000 egg collections a year, so it's very high throughput. And in those kind of settings, things like this can happen, go wrong. Fortunately, it hasn't yet. There's a lot of precautions that we've put in to try and make that the way. But yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a scenario where it's you have to speak to the patient, of course.
Yes.
No, there's no substitute for that. And I think that's kind of what hopefully we're getting at, is that there's a lot of stuff that's repetitive. Hopefully it's relatively straightforward. Push that. If it's things that are really critical, then you might just want to give a follow-up phone call as well.
Yes. Can also you have spread like the survey for the patient satisfaction can be also in the application, that they can fill the survey while they are already going.
Yeah, it's really easy. We just at the end of the cycle, there's a prompt that they get to fill in a survey, and that can actually be very helpful for the clinics as well. So they can have customizable ones that are, would only go back to the clinic. So yeah.
And instead also of asking them every time, please give us a review, give us a review.
Yeah, well, yeah, it would just be within the app, so it wouldn't go on like any of these public forum things or anything like that. Or I don't know what clinics value, Google or other ones, but it would just be held within the survey on the app. But hopefully useful data to them, and it's private as well, so
Yes.
they perhaps get more direct, honest feedback. I don't know.
All right, another question for Simon. Are there any data on cost savings / mistake reduction when a lab is running like clockwork that you know of?
We haven't quantified it in that way. I think if you remember the poster I showed from Esra with the reduction in time that the nurses were spent on the phones, that was actually in that clinic I just mentioned doing 9,000 egg collections. So of course no one's going to be letting staff go, but how can you scale and like bring things up to the next level? It's a form of saving in a way. So you can certainly look at it that way. I think as well, this is also data that I didn't show. Again, I'd be interested to hear from the embryologists on the panel whether they work like this. So this clinic in particular had an actual physical cap of egg collections they could cope with in one day. Let's just say I think it was 28. Anything above that, the lab would be in kind of close to meltdown. But because it was very difficult to predict 28 accurately, they had to set the limit much closer to a lower level. So I think it was like 22 or 23. So because all of a sudden one day it would jump up because they couldn't accurately predict the number of collections. When you can accurately predict the number of OPUs that's coming into the lab, you can set your threshold much higher. So the waiting list at this clinic dropped and the throughput increased. But because the levels were constant every single day, the lab didn't mind because they could staff it equally every single day and doing the same amount of work. So in terms of a throughput, again, it's about scale rather than cost reduction. You could say, and again, this is speculative. I would love to do the work with somebody if they're interested. If you can reduce the number of monitoring sessions for a natural FET, so if you're on average doing 3.5 and we take that down to 2.5 and that actually works for you, what does that mean for cost reductions? Can you pass that saving on to the patient? All those kind of things, really interesting to look at.
We gotta be careful to not get too efficient, otherwise the doctors will think we don't look busy enough. We've had that issue, busy days that we just do a really good job and the doctor's like, man, why is the lab, you guys don't seem like you're working very hard. Like, oh, we're just good. We do that. So we're gonna start wrapping up. We do have one last pretty important question that we're gonna open up for the whole panel. Is it scheduling or scheduling? Which is correct? I would prefer to be able to say schedule. I can't even say it right. Scheduling.
Scheduling sounds a little fancy.
Yes.
I think I might be a scheduler. I don't know.
You are.
I'm from the north of England, so my English is incomprehensible to most.
I think schedule, but I'm from Italy.
I just wish I was fancy enough to. Anytime if I have to tell somebody, let me check my schedule, I'll say schedule. Well, let me check my schedule. All right. We want to thank everyone who took part in this webinar, especially to my co-moderators, our speakers, Simon, the Lighthouse, Lumsdon, and Shakil Kanji. These talks were kindly sponsored by Fertility Billing Solution and Fertile AI.
Thank you so much, Shaun. It has been a pleasure for me also to join this fantastic gathering. And not to forget the team from AI, the organizing committee of this initiative, who are Jack Cohen, Peter Nagy, Mary Ann Betis, Thomas Elliott, Fran Farley, Violetta Sora, and Gilles Palmer.
And please join us next week because we have a fantastic webinar about abnormal fertilization, moving from visual PN checks to genetic confirmation with PGT. So,
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Can say
Thanks,
bye.
guys.
Thank